pass through. So we want to continue, and we are discussing what we call the historical and cultural context. The historical and cultural context. Now, it is important to understand that the Bible was not written with our culture in mind per se. The books were not developed in our culture, and that presupposes that if we want to be able to interpret these books, we have to understand the very culture in which the authors of both the New and the Old Testament situated their discussions. Now, it's important primarily because if it was not developed in our culture, then we have to know whether there is a relationship between ours and theirs. We have to know whether there is a point where we converge, whether there is a point where we diverge, so that in interpreting it, we can do justice to what the scriptures say. Randolph Tati, he is a hermeneutic. He says that communication is colored by behavior patterns, which are themselves culturally grounded. Communication is colored by behavior patterns, which are themselves culturally grounded. That means that if you observe how people communicate, if you observe how communication is done, one has to understand that there is a cultural dimension. And unless we are able to take care of the cultural dimension, we cannot understand what is being communicated. I don't know if you have watched maybe a foreign video on TV, on YouTube, and then this bishop, in the course of the preaching, gives an example or makes a statement or gives an illustration. And everybody in the room seems to understand the illustration the bishop gave. And yet you struggle to understand. Everybody's laughing. But you are wondering, what at all did this bishop say that everybody understood that I was not able to understand? Why did they intellectually cope with what was said immediately, but I am struggling? And sometimes we even have to go back to rewind and to listen again to see whether you'll be able to get what was said. And no matter the number of times you tried to do that, you were not able to understand what was said. Now, the question is, what was the problem? How come everybody understood and you did not understand? And the answer is that communication is colored by behavior patterns, which are culturally grounded. So unless I am in that culture, I cannot understand everything that was said. Even though the person might use a language I understand, the person might preach in English, but because of the fact that there is a cultural dimension, I will not be able to get. Now, in that case, we need to understand why we study cultural context. We need to understand why we study the historical context. One of the scholars who have shaped modern hermeneutics, his name is Paul Ricoeur. And Ricoeur comes out with what he called the 3 developmental stages of text. He did not have the Bible in mind per se, but he's talking about how text, we derive the text we have and the stages that they have gone through to be at the point that we have. And he outlines 3 of them. The first thing he talks about is event. So before we have a text, there is an event, or there are events. And then these events are recorded. in text. So for instance, most of us were not around when Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was around. There were certain events, but today we know some of the events, if not all. And the reason is that these events have been recorded in text. And then after they have been recorded in a text, they are given to a particular group of people or community, and the community reads and reinterpret what has been written in the text. And sometimes it is passed on from one community to another community. So in that sense, we have the original readers or the original audience, and then they passed it on to another community, another audience, another group of readers. Now, there are serious implications from stage 1 to stage 2 to the stage where we read the text. There are serious implications. And the first of it is that each of the stages we have is separated by a time gap. Usually, the people who record these events in text, they don't record them immediately the events happen. Sometimes there is a passage of time, and then they record the event in the text. And sometimes, depending on the audience you have, there is also another passage of time where what has been recorded in the text is read. So there is the time gap barrier. And for the New Testament, we are talking about centuries. Now, when Professor Gatti delivered her lecture last week, she made us understand that the New Testament document, particularly, are what we call the post-Easter document. A post-Easter document simply means that as if anything that happened, the disciples had pen and paper in their hands and they were recording. But what happened was that he told them certain things, they witnessed some things. And then with time, when he said, I will die, and they did not understand. And after the death and the resurrection, they began to interpret what he said and understood that he meant he was going to die and he would be raised. They now began to interpret the events in light of the Easter experiences. So these events and the time of the recording and the people reading the events, they are disconnected by a time gap. Number 2, we also have to understand that with time, because the events, the time of the recording, and the time of reading are separated by centuries, language and culture undergo changes with time. Every language. There are certain things that were said in the past that are not said today. And even if they are said today, there is a dimension that have either been added or been deleted or removed. So there is the language change, there is the cultural change. Now, for instance, let me talk about language change. Today, when we speak about biblical languages, we say so because the kind of language that was spoken, the Greek that was spoken in the time where Paul wrote, where we had the New Testament text, they did not speak modern Greek. As a matter of fact, there is what you call the classical Greek, and then we have the Koine Greek, the language of the Bible. Then we have modern Greek. So people who speak modern Greek today are not able to understand Koine Greek because they are not the same. And sometimes before they can understand, there has to be some interpretation. They have to take a class and know. In the same way, we speak about biblical Hebrew because the kind of Hebrew we had in the time of the Bible was quite different from the one that predates the Bible and different from what we have today. And as a matter of fact, what they had even before the Bible irrespective of the fact that you may have studied biblical languages, if they put that before you, you will not be able to read, let alone interpret. So you see that even with the languages, with time, they have undergone certain changes. Culture, we are told, is dynamic. There is that cultural change. And consequently, for us to be able to understand, we need to study the historical context. And then we need also to study the cultural context so that we are in a better position to interpret or understand the Bible. I'm sure that someone may be wondering, if I'm to study the historical, cultural context, where am I going to find them? And so I have some sources here. Anytime you read commentators, and then particularly when they are introducing a book of the Bible, let's say they're about to introduce the book of Mark, some good commentators or commentaries will give you some historical background. Pay attention. And in the midst of the historical context or background, they will give you some cultural implications or context or background. Take note of that. So you can find them not in the introduction of the commentary, because the introduction of the commentary talks about the commentary as a whole, but in the introduction of the books in the Bible that are captured in the commentaries, they will give you these backgrounds or context. Apart from commentaries, you also have Old and New Testament introductions, like the one Professor Gatti gave last week. When you have a good Old and New Testament introductions, they go into historical backgrounds, they go into cultural backgrounds, so you can take note of that. We also have Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias. Now, with the Bible dictionaries, sometimes when they pick a word and then they explain the word, sometimes certain words have to be situated within the historical or the cultural setting. So what the writer of the dictionary would do is to give some historical background, give you some cultural implications or connotations of the text. You want to do well to take note of that. Apart from that, you can find them in archaeological works and atlases. So every student of the Bible, you need to have some archaeological works and some atlases. Now, when we talk about atlases, we are not talking about modern atlases. We are talking about Bible atlases, because the then world is different from our world. So you can have the contemporary, and then you can have the ancient, the one that deals with the ancient map that can show you how the ancient world looked like. And you, in some situations, you can have ones where the ancient one and the contemporary one have been put in just a position. So you can go for some of these things. We also have books on Old Testament and New Testament theology that will give you some of these things. You want to take advantage of that one. And then we have books on customs and culture of the Bible. There are books on customs and culture of the Bible. Please take advantage of those books. Now there is a legitimate question to ask. The question is, if I want to do a study on the historical context, I want to do a study on the cultural context, what do I have to look for? Because if I miss these details, I guarantee that you will not be able to find the quality information you are looking for. Now, sometimes when you read a commentary, you will notice that, or any book related to biblical studies, you will notice that, for instance, the author is talking about maybe Isaiah. And then in talking about Isaiah, he tells you, or the prophecies of Isaiah, and then he begins to give you certain dates. Isaiah was born on this particular day. His history spans from this particular empire to this particular empire. He prophesied in the time of these prophets are his contemporaries. What is he seeking to do? He's trying to give you a time frame. He's giving you a time frame. What's the purpose of this time frame? Now, the purpose of this date or time is to give you, for instance, if you are dealing with a book written by Paul, and then you give a time and the historical facts show that at that time Paul was dead, or at that time Paul had not been born, it means that we cannot talk about accuracy and reliability. So books that are attributed to Paul, one of the ways the scholars are able to determine that these could have been written by Paul is to look at the time or the date of that book. So the date is important. Again, for instance, if we are dealing with the history of Ghana and the person who wrote the book, we are talking about the Republic, and the person wrote the book in maybe December 1960. If the person is an honest historian, you are likely to get a reliable information in that book than someone writing in the year 2020. As a matter of fact, the one writing in the year 2020 would have to cite from a book written in that time so that there can be accuracy, there can be reliability. So when you read commentators and they are giving you date, they are giving you time, I mean, they are dealing with historical fact, so you can talk about accuracy and reliability. And then we talk about authorial authority, and that's just what I've explained. Authorial authority is when the actual book, the dating of the book, coincides or agrees with the historical fact that this person was born on this date, worked around this time, prophesied around this time. It makes the book credible. We can say, indeed, it could have been written by this author because of the time frame. And then when the book gives a date, we are dealing with historicity. If it's a historical book, it means that the person is given a historical evidence that the events narrated did indeed happen. So, for instance, in the Gospels, you see that the infancy narratives or the birth narratives that talk about the birth of Jesus Christ, you will notice that there are certain events, and when this person ordered that every person should go to their hometown to register, they gave certain events to prove the historicity of what has been documented. We can also talk about the context of the content. When you have a date, when you have a time, it is the time that defines the context of that content. And as we proceed, you will understand the context of the content in relation to time very clearly. Because one thing about the time is that it affects the theology. There is a relationship between time and theology. When we began, I gave an example where in the Old Testament, women were considered, not in the Old Testament in entirety, at some stage in the Old Testament, women were classified as part of the properties of the husband. But that kind of ideology, of theology, changed not in the New Testament, but even in the Old Testament, where this time around, the wife as part of the properties of the husband. And so, if you are reading something like that, you need to know the time, because an understanding of the time will define the theology of the day. Again, that time will define the ideology, because in biblical times, theology and ideologies coincided. So when you know the time, you are able to know the kind of theology, you are able to know the kind of ideology. Now, ideological context is a broad topic that we will discuss that also, the ideological context. Again, time also gives us a clue to the cultural context. I've said it over and over. with time, you know, the cultural practices that were prevalent in that particular time, in that particular environment, in the ancient Near East. So when you have the date, when you have the time, you are able to discern culture out of time. And then language, as I was saying, language. The time defines the language. In Greek, we have classical, we have Koine Greek, we have modern. In Hebrew, we have Paleo Hebrew, which modern or contemporary of Hebrew interpret. In fact, biblical scholars cannot interpret. You can't even read and interpret. And then we have biblical Hebrew, and then we have modern Hebrew. And so you see how the date alone, affect a lot of things about the historical context. The date alone. Apart from the date, you need to look at the authorship. Who wrote the book? It's very significant. Now, in hermeneutics, that's what you call the real author and the implied author. So when we talk about authorship, unlike in other fields, in hermeneutics, some hermeneutics talk about the real author and the implied author. Now, who is the real author? Who is the real author and who is the implied author? The real author actually is the person who wrote the book. But the real author also becomes an implied author in the sense that the moment you begin to write and then you certain things about yourself in the book, you become the implied author. So the real author becomes the implied author in the process of writing. It's only in the process of writing that we refer to him or her as the implied author, because he is the one whom the reader constructs from the text itself. What we construct from the text is what tells us about the author. And that is why we are careful not to talk about real author, but we talk about the implied author. For instance, if you read my book and you don't know me in person, the only thing you can know about me is what I've chosen to reveal in the book. So unless I reveal in the book, you cannot claim to know me as the author. You can only claim to know the implied author because of what I have revealed. So when we talk about the implied author, we are talking about the linguistic features, the historical data that has been supported in the book for us to trace who the author is. That's the difference between the real author and the implied author. So statements are relevant. If you want to know the authorship, you need to ask who wrote the book, who is the author. And again, you need to know the background of the author. So what was his background? Because the background of the author gives a lot of information about his theology. For instance, if you read about the crucifixion narrative, passion narrative, you know that by virtue of one's author background in medicine, the kind of information he gives, about the way Jesus died is different from another person who does not have that background. So you need to know what was his background. And again, you also need to know his relationship with the people he addressed. What was his relationship? When Paul says, love to be with you to impart spiritual gifts. When Paul talks about beloved, when Paul talks about brethren, he is establishing a particular relationship. When Paul talks about his son Timothy, he is establishing a particular relationship. Now, unless you go behind the relationship, unless you understand the relationship, there are certain components of the writing that you are bound to miss. So you need to know the kind of relationship that exists between the author and the audience. Again, you also need to ask the purpose writing? What was his purpose? What did he seek to achieve? Because when you know the purpose of writing, you are more likely to interpret the text, and you are more likely to understand the purpose. Because the purpose of writing can even influence the themes in the book. For instance, I've given Job as an example over and over. For instance, if you know that the purpose of the book of Job was to address the problem of the theology of retribution, you will know he talks about why the righteous suffer. You will know why he takes time to explain the suffering of Job. And you will know why he explains God's answer to the suffering in the book of Job. So the purpose in writing, you need to find out. That's about the authorship. About the authorship. Now we talk about the audience. The audience in seeking to discover or build this cultural and historical context. You need to know the audience. And just like the author, for the audience, we also have the implied reader or audience. We have the real audience or reader and the implied reader or audience. Who is the implied audience? The implied audience is the one that is presupposed by the narrative.